You're standing in 1890s London. The air is thick with coal smoke and the scent of damp wool. You trip. It's a minor stumble on a cobblestone street, but as your skirt flutters, it happens. A glimpse of white stocking. A flash of a curved bone just above the shoe. In an instant, the world stops. The gentleman across the street averts his eyes as if he's witnessed a crime. A matron nearby clicks her tongue, a sound sharper than a gunshot. In the next 10 minutes, your reputation, the only currency you truly own, has just devalued by 50%. Because in Victorian England, an ankle wasn't just a joint. It was a scandal. It was a weapon. It was an erotic masterpiece that could ruin a life. Welcome to an era where the human body was a biological secret. If you were a proper lady, you didn't have legs. No, legs were for pianos and horses. You had lower limbs or extremities. To speak the word leg in mixed company was to invite a mental image of what lay beneath those 5 layers of petticoats. And in the Victorian mind, imagination was the first step toward damnation. Consider the physics of the dress. It wasn't fashion, it was a fortress. You wore a chemise, a corset that rearranged your internal organs like a Tetris game, a corset cover, at least 3 petticoats, and finally, the heavy wool or silk gown. By the time you stepped outside, you were carrying 15 pounds of fabric. Why? To ensure that no gust of wind, no matter how rebellious, could ever reveal the shape of a human calf. The obsession was so deep that women actually sewed lead coins into the hems of their skirts. Imagine the weight. Every step was a workout. Every stroll through Hyde Park, a test of endurance. But the alternative was worse. If the wind caught your dress and showed even an inch of stocking, the gossip mill would label you fast or forward before the sunset. But here is the absurdity. While your ankles were treated like top-secret state intelligence, your shoulders and chest in an evening gown were perfectly acceptable. The Victorians had a very selective sense of eroticism. A bare collarbone? Elegant? A bare ankle? Call the priest. This wasn't just about modesty, it was about control. By making the body invisible, society made the woman invisible. You were a walking silhouette of propriety. You didn't walk, you glided. You didn't sit, you perched. If you felt the urge to run, you suppressed it, because running made things jiggle. And jiggling was the enemy of the empire. As we peel back these layers over the next 14 chapters, you'll realize that the Victorian era wasn't just boring or stiff. It was a high-stakes game of survival where a single inch of skin could be the difference between a grand wedding and social exile. But the body wasn't the only thing they tried to sanitize. Wait until you see what they did to the most innocent act of all: eating. Because in the next part, we're going into the dining room, where even a banana was a moral minefield. Imagine you've survived the corset. You've successfully navigated the street without showing an ankle. Now, you're invited to a 12-course dinner at a duke's manor. You are starving. But as you sit down, you realize the silver-plated forks, knives, and spoons laid out before you resemble a small, gleaming army ready for war. And in a way, it is a war. A war against your own hunger, your own hands, and, most dangerously, against the fruit bowl. Because in this room, a single bite of a banana could end your social life faster than a public confession of treason. In the Victorian dining room, eating was not a biological necessity. It was a performance of restraint. You didn't just pick up a fork. You chose the specific fork for the 3rd course of fish, ensuring your pinky finger was angled at exactly 45 degrees. To use the wrong spoon for your soup was to signal to the entire room that your father was likely a tradesman who worked with his hands. But the real psychological horror began with the suggestive foods. Steamships were bringing exotic fruits to London for the first time. The banana was a marvel, but to the Victorian moral police, It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Its shape, indecent. The act of peeling it, explicit. If you were a lady, you never, absolutely never, peeled a banana with your hands. To hold a banana and peel it back was seen as an act of intolerable intimacy. Instead, you were expected to use a silver fruit knife and fork. You would cut off both ends, slit the skin lengthwise, lay the fruit open like a surgical patient, and cut it into tiny, dainty discs. You ate it as if it were a strange, soft potato. If a single drop of juice touched your glove, you were a failure. Peaches were even worse. A peach is soft, fuzzy, and prone to dripping. To bite directly into a peach, letting the juice run down your chin, was practically a pornographic act in 1880. There are stories of young women being quietly removed from guest lists simply because they attacked a peach with too much enthusiasm. The rule was simple. If a fruit required biting, licking, or sucking, you didn't touch it. You chose the dry biscuit. You chose the grape. But even then, you used grape scissors to snip a small cluster. Picking a single grape from the main bunch with your fingers, you might as well have spat on the tablecloth. Thirst was another trap. A lady never ever drained her glass. To be thirsty was to have desires, and a Victorian woman was supposed to be a creature of pure spirit, fueled by nothing but tea and propriety. You took tiny sips, dabbing your lips with a damask napkin after every single one. As you sat there, starving and dehydrated, surrounded by the finest delicacies of the empire, you realized the ultimate Victorian truth. The goal of the dinner party wasn't to eat. It was to prove that you didn't need to eat. But if you think the dining room was dangerous, wait until we look in the mirror. Because while the food was restricted, the beauty products were lethal. In the next part, we're going into the vanity of the Victorian lady, where the secret ingredient to a perfect complexion was quite literally death. Before you even touch a fork, you face your first enemy, the menu. In a high society London dinner, the menu was never in English, it was in French. Always. This was a deliberate filter. If you couldn't pronounce consommé à la royale or caneton à la rouennaise, you were effectively announcing that you didn't belong. Asking the waiter, "What is this?" was social suicide. You were expected to know. So, many young ladies spent their afternoons memorizing French culinary dictionaries, terrified they might accidentally order a dish made of calf's brains while trying to sound sophisticated. You ate with your ears first, and a single mispronunciation was a one-way ticket to being ignored for the rest of the night. As the courses arrive, you realize the Victorians had a specific silver tool for everything. There were marrow scoops, lobster picks, and the infamous asparagus tongs. Asparagus was a nightmare for a lady. To pick it up with your fingers was common. To cut it with a knife was barbaric. You had to use specialized tongs to lift the stalk, dip the tip into hollandaise sauce, and somehow transport it to your mouth without a single drop falling onto your lace bodice. If the stalk was too limp, you left it. A Victorian lady would rather starve than be seen struggling with a floppy vegetable. But the most exhausting rule wasn't about the food. It was about the clock. It was called the turning of the table. During the first half of the dinner, the hostess would talk to the person on her right. This meant everyone else at the table also had to talk to the person on their right. You could be seated next to the most boring man in England, but you were legally bound by etiquette to entertain him for exactly 1 hour. Then, at a secret signal from the hostess, usually a subtle nod, or the shifting of her fan, the table turned. Suddenly, everyone had to stop their current conversation mid-sentence and pivot to the neighbor on their left. If you were caught still talking to the right-hand neighbor after the pivot, you were seen as clinging. If you sat in silence because you didn't like your left-hand neighbor, you were frosty. You were a social acrobat, performing on a stage made of mahogany and candlelight. And what about your gloves? You couldn't eat with them on, but you couldn't just throw them on the table like a peasant. You had to peel them off subtly, finger by finger, under the table, and hide them in your lap beneath a heavy damask napkin. If a glove slipped and landed on the floor, you couldn't bend down to get it. Remember, squatting or bending was forbidden. You had to wait for a footman to retrieve it, and as he handed it back, the entire table would know you were a woman who couldn't keep her accessories in check. You are exhausted, hungry, and your brain hurts from fake French and timed conversations. You think the ordeal is over when the dessert arrives. But as you catch your reflection in a silver spoon, you notice your skin. It's not pale enough, it's not Victorian enough, and that leads us to the most dangerous room in the house, the dressing room. Look into the mirror. What do you see? If you see a healthy sun-kissed glow, you have failed. In 1850, a tan was the mark of a peasant, someone who spent their days laboring in the fields. A lady, however, was expected to be translucent. Your skin had to be so pale, so thin, that the blue veins beneath your temples were visible, like delicate rivers of ink on a marble slab. This was the consumption look. Ironically, the Victorians were so obsessed with the romanticized image of tuberculosis, the thinness, the pale skin, the feverish eyes, that they began to recreate the symptoms of a terminal illness as the height of fashion. You weren't just looking for beauty, you were looking for a beautiful death. To achieve this ghostly pallor, many women turned to the kitchen pantry, or rather, the apothecary's back shelf. Meet the arsenic complexion wafer. Yes, arsenic, one of the most potent poisons known to man. Advertisements in newspapers promised these wafers would clear the skin of all impurities and provide a brilliant, transparent complexion. And they did, but at a horrific cost. Arsenic works by destroying red blood cells, literally killing your blood, to make your skin look white. You would nibble on these wafers daily. At first, you felt a strange energy. Your skin cleared. You looked radiant in a sickly, ethereal way. But soon, the poison began its real work. Your hair started to thin. Your breath smelled like garlic, a telltale sign of arsenic buildup. If you tried to stop, your skin would erupt in violent sores. You were an addict to your own slow execution. You were eating your way to a grave, one wafer at a time, all for the sake of a compliment at a garden party. If you weren't eating poison, you were painting it on. The most popular foundation of the era was Venetian ceruse, a mixture of water, vinegar, and heavy lead. Imagine applying a thick white paste to your face, neck, and shoulders every morning. It filled in the smallpox scars and smoothed out the wrinkles. It looked perfect from a distance. But lead is a heavy metal that absorbs directly into the pores. Over months of use, the leaden mask would begin to rot your skin from the inside out. Your teeth would turn gray and begin to fall out. Your gums would recede. Your breath would become foul. And the tragedy? To hide the graying, rotting skin caused by the lead, you simply applied more lead. You were building a literal sarcophagus of makeup on your own living face. Many women died of lead poisoning, their skin so saturated with metal that it felt like cold clay to the touch. But the skin was only half the battle. A Victorian lady needed soulful eyes, wide, dilated pupils that suggested a state of perpetual excitement or deep, poetic melancholy. The solution was belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade. You would take a dropper and squeeze the juice of this lethal plant directly into your eyes. It worked brilliantly. It paralyzed the muscles of your iris, keeping your pupils wide and dark, even in a bright room. But as the world became beautiful and blurry, the poison was working on your optic nerves. Long-term use of belladonna drops led to permanent blindness. Imagine the irony. You spent your life trying to be seen, only to lose the ability to see the world you were trying to impress. And for the body? To keep that wasp waist we'll discuss in the next part, some women would drink diluted ammonia or vinegar, to shrivel their appetite. Others washed in water laced with ammonia to bleach their skin even further. The smell of a Victorian lady in a ballroom wasn't just roses and lavender. It was often a pungent chemical undertone of cleaning agents and slow-acting toxins. You were a masterpiece of chemistry and denial. You were a walking monument to the lengths a human being will go to satisfy a social requirement. You were breathtaking, and you were literally chemically dying for it. But as the toxins invaded your blood, a physical cage was being tightened around your ribs, because the poisons on your skin were only the beginning. In the next part, we go from the vanity table to the wardrobe, to the invention that rearranged the human skeleton and caused internal organs to shift in ways nature never intended. Welcome to the era of the corset prison. But suppose your skin wasn't just pale. Suppose it had the audacity to have freckles. In the Victorian era, freckles were seen as a moral failure, a sign that you had been outside like a common laborer. To erase these sun kisses, women turned to corrosive sublimate, a polite name for mercury. You would apply a mercury-based cream to your spots every night. Mercury doesn't just lighten skin, it corrodes it. It strips away the top layer of your dermis. As you slept, the mercury was being absorbed into your bloodstream, heading straight for your brain. The symptoms? Tremors, loose teeth, and a metallic taste in the mouth that no amount of peppermint tea could hide. You were literally losing your mind to save your face, and the poison wasn't just on your skin, it was against it. Imagine the most beautiful gown in the ballroom, a vibrant electric green that shimmered under the gaslight. This was Paris green, or Scheele's green, a dye made primarily of copper arsenite. Yes, your dress was made of arsenic. As you danced and your body temperature rose, the arsenic dust from the fabric would flake off. It would settle in your pores, causing painful ulcers and bright green rashes under your arms and around your neck. But you weren't the only victim. The seamstresses who made these dresses died in agony. Their lungs turned green by the dust they inhaled. A single green ball gown contained enough arsenic to kill a dozen people. You were quite literally a walking toxic hazard, a beautiful shimmering weapon of mass destruction. To maintain that frail, ghostly figure, some Victorian women went beyond vinegar and ammonia. Enter the most stomach-churning supplement of the 19th century, the tapeworm pill. The idea was simple and horrifying. You would swallow a pill containing the egg of a tapeworm. Once it hatched in your intestines, it would eat the food you consumed, allowing you to stay thin while still attending those 12-course dinners we discussed earlier. You were intentionally hosting a parasite that would grow to several feet long inside your body. The result? You looked fashionably wasted away. Your eyes were sunken, your skin sallow, exactly what society demanded. But as the worm grew, it began to steal your very life force. And the cure for removing it? Doctors would sometimes hold a bowl of milk in front of the patient's open mouth, hoping the worm would smell the food and crawl out. Finally, let's talk about your hair. If the stress of Victorian life turned your hair gray, you reached for coal tar dyes. These early chemical dyes were incredibly unstable. If you had a small scratch on your scalp, the coal tar could cause your head to swell to twice its size, or worse, lead to sudden, fatal allergic reactions. But a lady with gray hair was a lady without a future. So, you took the risk. You dyed your hair with industrial waste, painted your face with lead, and wore a dress made of poison. You were a chemical experiment in a silk gown. But even as the mercury rotted your mind and the arsenic burned your skin, you had to stand perfectly still. You couldn't even take a deep breath to cry out in pain. Why? Because you were locked inside the most iconic torture device in history. In the next part, we go from the toxins in your blood to the steel around your ribs. It's time to enter the corset prison. Hold your breath. Now, try to take another. You can't. You're standing in your dressing room, gripping the bedpost until your knuckles turn white. Behind you, your maid is bracing her foot against your lower back, pulling the silken cords with the strength of a sailor. You feel your ribs groan. You hear a soft, sickening pop. That's your floating rib yielding to the pressure. Welcome to the wasp waist. In 1870, a 24-inch waist was considered obese. To be a lady of status, you aimed for 18, 16 if you were ambitious, 13 if you were ready to die for the front page of a fashion gazette. You weren't just wearing an undergarment, you were wearing a cage of steel and whalebone designed to rearrange your very soul. What happens to a human body when it is compressed by 30 pounds of pressure, 14 hours a day for 20 years? It migrates. Because your ribs are being crushed inward, your internal organs have nowhere to go but down. Your liver is slowly being pushed into your pelvis, often sliced into sections by the lower ribs. Your stomach is squeezed so tightly that digestion becomes a painful multi-day ordeal, which explains why you only pecked at that 12-course dinner. Your lungs? They lose nearly 20% of their capacity. You are living in a state of permanent, low-level suffocation. History books often mock Victorian women for being fragile or prone to fainting. They invented the fainting couch, a specialized piece of furniture found in every respectable parlor. But let's be clear, women didn't faint because they were overwhelmed by a poem or a shocking piece of news. They fainted because they were oxygen deprived. When your heart rate rose from excitement or fear, your lungs couldn't expand to provide the extra oxygen needed. Your brain simply shut down to save itself. The fainting couch wasn't a symbol of feminine weakness. It was a medical necessity for a society that literally took its daughter's breath away. The horror didn't stop when you took the corset off at night. After years of tight lacing, your back muscles, the ones meant to hold you upright, simply gave up. They atrophied from disuse. Without the steel busk of the corset, many women found they could no longer sit or stand for more than a few minutes. You became a prisoner of the bone. You needed the corset to survive the day, and the corset was the very thing destroying your ability to live. You were a structural masterpiece held together by external wires, a human being transformed into a rigid, upright doll. Why did they do it? Because a loose corset suggested a loose woman. A straight spine was equated with a straight moral compass. To be unlaced was to be unchaste. Society demanded that your ribs be crushed so that your virtue could remain intact. You were a monument to self-denial, your pain hidden beneath silk and lace, your screams muffled by the very fabric that defined your beauty. But as your body was locked in steel, your mind was being locked in a different kind of silence. Because while you couldn't breathe, you also weren't allowed to speak. In the next part, we move from the physical cage to the psychological one. We're going to explore the language of silence, where a woman had to communicate her deepest desires using nothing but a handheld fan and a fluttering eyelid. You think the torture began at 18? No. In the Victorian world, the correction of the female form began in the nursery. Imagine a 5-year-old girl. She is growing, her bones still soft as wax. But according to the manuals of the time, nature must be guided. She is fitted with her first corded stay. A soft corset, but a corset nonetheless. By age 10, the cords are replaced with stiff whalebone. This wasn't about fashion yet. It was about posture. They believed that without external support, a girl's spine would simply collapse under the weight of her own thoughts. You were literally grown inside a mold, like a square watermelon. By the time you reached womanhood, your ribs hadn't just been crushed, they had been trained to never expand. You didn't know what a full breath felt like because you had never, not once since childhood, been allowed to take one. There were those who took the obsession to the ultimate, fatal limit. In the 1860s, a story circulated about a young bride-to-be who was determined to have the smallest waist in London for her wedding day. She tight-laced herself so severely that her waist measured a mere 13 inches, the circumference of a large grapefruit. During the wedding breakfast, she collapsed. They thought it was bridal nerves. It wasn't. When they finally unlaced her, the sudden release of pressure caused her internal organs, which had been compressed like a spring, to shift so violently that she died of internal hemorrhaging before the cake was cut. She died for a measurement. She was a martyr to a silhouette. But here is the secret the history books often whisper. The corset wasn't just for the ladies. The dandies of London, the high-fashion men like Beau Brummel, were equally obsessed with the V-taper torso. Military officers wore corsets to maintain a rigid, authoritative posture under their heavy wool tunics. If a gentleman's waist looked a little too prosperous after a few too many glasses of port, he would slip into a belt or a waist constrictor. While women were mocked for their vanity, men wore theirs in secret, a hidden layer of steel beneath the broadcloth. Vanity, it seems, was a universal prison, but only one gender was forced to live in it publicly. The most invisible horror, however, occurred within the womb. For a Victorian woman, her primary duty was to produce heirs. But how do you carry a child when your pelvis is crushed and your abdominal muscles have turned to mush? Pregnancy corsets existed, stiff, unyielding garments designed to hide the condition for as long as possible. The results were catastrophic. Displaced fetuses, excruciating labors, and high mortality rates for both mother and child. You were caught in a lethal paradox. Society demanded you be a mother, but fashion demanded you be a doll. To satisfy one, you often had to sacrifice the other, or your life. Listen closely to a Victorian ballroom. Beneath the violins and the polite chatter, there is a hidden symphony. The creak of leather, the groan of steel busks, the collective shallow panting of 300 women whose lungs are fighting a war against their wardrobes. It was a beautiful, shimmering, suffocating lie. But as the steel rearranged your bones, a different kind of arrangement was happening in the parlors. Because even if you couldn't breathe, you still had to hunt for a husband. And in a world where a woman's voice was often ignored, she had to invent a secret language of her own. In the next part, we unlock the language of silence, where a simple flick of a silk fan could be an invitation to a lifetime of love or a cold, calculated rejection. Imagine a ballroom in 1885. The music is loud, but the room is eerily silent. A young man across the floor catches your eye. You want to tell him you're interested, but your mother is sitting 3 feet away, and your chaperone is monitoring your every breath. If you speak to him without a formal introduction, your reputation is burned. If you stare too long, you're bold. So, you reach for your fan. In the Victorian era, silence wasn't an absence of communication. It was a sophisticated high-speed telegraphy. Since a lady's voice was strictly regulated, she turned her accessories into a biological extension of her will. Welcome to the language of the fan, the secret software of the 19th century dating market. The fan wasn't for cooling off, it was for talking. Every movement was a sentence, every position was a status update. The invitation. If you carried your fan in your right hand, held in front of your face, it meant, "Follow me." The rejection. If you rested the fan on your right cheek, it was a cold, hard no. The confession. Drawing the fan across your cheek slowly, "I love you." The warning. Dropping the fan suddenly wasn't an accident. It meant, we are being watched, we must be just friends. Imagine the mental gymnastics required. You had to maintain a serene, empty facial expression while your hands were frantically typing out a private DM across a crowded room. One wrong flick of the wrist, and you've accidentally promised to marry a man you actually intended to insult. But the fan was only the beginning. If things got serious, you moved to the handkerchief code. A lady's handkerchief was a piece of lace-edged propaganda. If you drew it across your lips, it meant, I desire to be acquainted. If you let it rest on your left shoulder, I am followed. And if you wound it around your third finger, that was the ultimate signal. I am married, but I am bored. It was a world of open loops. You were constantly sending signals, waiting for a response, and praying that the wrong person, like your father, didn't know the code. Even the sun was a tool for flirting. The parasol was the ultimate defensive and offensive weapon. Carrying it over the left shoulder meant, I wish to speak with you. Twirling it in your left hand, I am watching you. Closing it suddenly, I have no interest. But here is the psychological twist. This secret language gave women a strange kind of power. In a world where men made all the formal decisions, women controlled the subtext. They decided who could approach, who was invited to hope, and who was cast into the dark. It was a game of invisible chess, played with silk, ivory, and lace. The cost of a misclick in this language was social exile. There are accounts of young men duel fighting because they misinterpreted a ladies' fan movement as an invitation when it was merely a cooling gesture. You were a woman of 1,000 unspoken words. You were locked in a corset, poisoned by your makeup, and silenced by your culture. But through that little silk fan, you were still a rebel. You were still finding a way to say, I am here, and I have something to say. But as you mastered the art of talking with your hands, you had to learn the even more difficult art of moving your feet. Because walking was not just about getting from point A to point B. It was a social geometry where a single wrong step could label you a woman of the night. In the next part, we step outside. Welcome to social geometry, where the pavement was the ultimate judge. If the fan was the instant message of the Victorian era, then the bouquet was the encrypted email. In a society where saying, I find you attractive was practically a crime, the Victorians turned to nature. They created floriography, a complex botanical dictionary where every petal carried a specific, unchangeable weight. You didn't just give a girl flowers, you sent her a coded manifesto. Imagine receiving a tussie-mussy, a small handheld bouquet. The red rose, a direct I love you, simple, classic. The striped carnation, a brutal floral no, a refusal of a proposal without a single word being spoken. The yellow rose, a stinging accusation of infidelity or jealousy. The dried white rose, the ultimate heartbreak. Death is preferable to loss of innocence, or you have withered my heart. But the software was even more complex. If you handed a flower with your right hand, the answer was yes. With your left hand? No. If the flowers were presented upside down, the meaning was reversed. You had to be a part-time botanist and a full-time spy just to understand if your date wanted to marry you or leave you forever. But what happened when you were at home, away from the ballrooms? You turned to the postage stamp. In the 1890s, the way you licked and placed a stamp on an envelope was a status update. If the chaperone or a nosy father checked the mail, they only saw a letter. But to the recipient, the stamp was the real message. Stamp in the top left corner, I hate you. Stamp upside down in the top right, I am engaged. Stamp tilted at a 45-degree angle, write no more, we are watched. Stamp placed sideways, my heart is another's. Imagine the pressure. One shaky hand, one crooked stamp, and you've accidentally told your true love that you loathe them while telling the man you despise that you're ready to elope. Even your eyes weren't allowed to be natural. A lady was taught the modest gaze. You looked down, always. To look a man directly in the eye for more than 2 seconds was seen as an invitation to sin. But there was a loophole, the mirror. In the ballroom, women used the massive gilded mirrors to watch the men behind them. You weren't looking at him, you were observing the room. It was the 19th century version of stalking someone's profile without leaving a viewed notification. You saw everything while appearing to see nothing. All of this, the fans, the flowers, the stamps, was a desperate reaction to the chaperone. She was the human firewall, an older eagle-eyed woman whose sole job was to prevent unscripted moments. The silence wasn't just a choice. It was a survival tactic against the constant surveillance of a society that didn't trust its own youth. You lived in a world of whispers because the walls had ears, the mirrors had eyes, and your own mother was the lead investigator. You've mastered the art of talking without speaking. You've survived the poisons and the steel cages, but now you have to step outside. And on the streets of London, the rules change again, because how you walk and who you walk with determines if you are a lady or a social pariah. Welcome to social geometry, where the pavement is a battlefield. The front door opens. The sallow fog of London rolls in, smelling of horse manure and coal soot. You take your first step onto the pavement. But remember, you are no longer a person. You are a moving piece of property. You are a walking reputation. In the Victorian world, the street was a theater where everyone was a critic, and every critic was a judge. This was social geometry, a set of invisible lines that dictated exactly where, when, and how a lady could move. If you broke the symmetry, you didn't just stumble, you fell. And in this era, there was nothing more terrifying than a fallen woman. First rule, never walk alone. If you are under 30 and unmarried, walking the streets of London unaccompanied was a declaration of war against your own honor. To be seen alone was to be seen as available, and not in a romantic way. It suggested you were a streetwalker, a term that carried a lethal social weight. To prevent this, you had the chaperone. She was usually an older, sour-faced woman, your aunt, your mother, or a hired professional. She didn't walk with you. She moved like a silent shadow behind you. She was your human firewall, a physical proof that you were guarded. Without her, you were a ghost. With her, you were a lady. If you saw a friend across the street, you couldn't run to her. You had to wait for your chaperone to give a subtle nod, then glide. Never run toward your target. Speed was the enemy of grace. A lady never hurried. Running in public suggested you had a destination that was urgent, and urgency suggested a life that was messy. You moved with a measured rhythmic glide. And then there was the downward gaze. As you walked, your eyes were expected to be fixed about 4 feet in front of your toes. To look a stranger in the eye was an invitation. To look into a shop window for too long was idleness. You had to navigate a crowded city while appearing to be completely oblivious to its existence. You were a master of invisibility in plain sight. Every corner you turned was a risk. One wrong turn into a low-rent district, one accidental conversation with a man of uncertain character, and the ghost of the fallen woman would latch onto your shadow. The fallen woman was the ultimate Victorian boogeyman. She was the woman who had lost her virtue, her status, and her family. She was a social pariah, a shadow in the fog that proper ladies were taught to ignore so completely, it was as if she were made of air. But the terrifying truth, the line between a lady and a fallen woman, was only as thick as a single piece of gossip. You walked in constant fear that a smudge on your hem or a loose strand of hair would be the first step toward your own social execution. Certain streets were off limits. Certain parks were dangerous after 2 p.m. You carried a mental map of London that was divided into virtue and vice. To cross the wrong bridge was to enter a world where the rules of the ballroom no longer protected you. You were a prisoner of geography. Your world was a series of safe islands: the parlor, the carriage, the church, and the approved shopping street. Everything else was the great unknown, a dark ocean where reputations went to drown. You've survived the streets. You've maintained your geometry. But there is one place where even the most rigid rules are finally broken: the grave. Because in the Victorian world, even death had an etiquette. In the next part, we enter the darkest room of all. Welcome to the Art of Mourning, where you'll learn why a widow had to wear black for 2 years, and why the most precious thing you could own was a lock of hair from a dead man. The heartbeat has stopped, but for a Victorian family, the work has just begun. Before the doctor even leaves the room, the house transforms. You rush to cover every mirror in the home with heavy black crepe. Why? Because you fear the soul of the departed might get trapped in the glass. You stop the clocks at the exact moment of death to freeze time. You even whisper the news to the beehives in the garden so the bees don't fly away in confusion. Welcome to the Victorian cult of death. In an era where the average life expectancy was 40, death wasn't an event. It was an industry. And at the center of this industry was a woman, draped in black, turned into a living monument of grief. Of this culture was Queen Victoria herself. When her beloved Prince Albert died in 1861, she didn't just mourn, she turned mourning into a national religion. She wore black for 40 years. She turned her entire life into a shrine. Because of her, your grief was regulated by a stopwatch. As a widow, you were entered into deep mourning. For 1 year and 1 day, you wore Parramatta silk, or crepe, a heavy, scratchy black fabric that looked like charcoal and felt like sandpaper. You couldn't wear jewelry unless it was made of jet, fossilized coal. You were a shadow in your own home, forbidden from social gatherings, a ghost among the living. But as the body grew cold, a stranger arrived at the door, the photographer. In 1880, a photograph was a luxury. Many families never had a picture of their loved ones while they were alive. So, they took one when they were dead. This is post-mortem photography. Imagine the scene. The deceased child is dressed in their Sunday best. They are propped up on a specialized metal stand, their eyes sometimes painted onto their closed lids by the photographer to make them look awake. You sit beside them, holding their cold hand, smiling for the camera. It was your only way to keep them. To modernize, it's a nightmare. To a Victorian mother, it was the only act of love left. It was a memento mori, a reminder that you too shall die. But pictures weren't enough. You wanted a piece of them. Literally. You would take a lock of hair from the deceased and send it to a specialized jeweler. They would braid it, weave it into intricate patterns, and set it under glass in a brooch or a ring. You wore the hair of your dead child around your neck. You wore the hair of your late husband on your wrist. This wasn't creepy to you. It was sentimental. Your jewelry box was a cemetery of memories. You were physically tethered to the graveyard, carrying the weight of the dead in every lace-trimmed step you took. Slowly, the black would fade. After 2 years, you could enter half mourning. You could finally wear lavender, mauve, or gray. You were re-entering the world like a diver surfacing for air. But for many, the mourning never truly ended. You had been trained to love the darkness. You had been taught that the more you suffered, the more virtuous you were. In the Victorian world, a woman's heart was measured by the depth of her black veil and the coldness of the hair brooch against her skin. But while you were obsessed with the souls of the dead, a new kind of ghost was haunting the libraries. A man named Charles Darwin was whispering that we weren't divine beings, but evolved creatures. In the next part, we move from the cemetery to the study. Welcome to Forbidden Knowledge, where we discover the books that were considered too dangerous for a woman's brain to handle, but your family's grief wasn't enough to satisfy the neighbors. To truly prove your status, you needed professional help. Enter the mutes. These were men hired from the local undertaker, dressed in floor-length black capes and top hats draped in weepers, long silk streamers. Their only job was to stand outside your front door for hours, perfectly still, with expressions of profound artificial misery. They weren't allowed to speak. They weren't allowed to smile. They were human decorations of sorrow. If you were wealthy, you hired a dozen. If you were poor, you starved yourself for a month just to afford two. Because in London, if a mute wasn't standing at your door, did your loved one even truly exist? Grief was a commodity, and silence was something you paid for by the hour. The cost of dying was often higher than the cost of living. A proper Victorian funeral required plumed horses, specifically black horses for adults and white for children. It required funeral biscuits wrapped in black-edged paper, personalized mourning rings for every guest, and a feast that could bankrupt a middle-class family for a decade. Many families fell into the debt of the dead. They lived in squalor so they could bury their father in a mahogany casket with silver handles. It was the ultimate irony. You would literally starve the living to ensure the dead looked respectable in a hole 6 feet deep. But as the dirt began to fall on the casket, a silent panic gripped the mourners. What if the doctor was wrong? In an era before modern ECGs, premature burial was a widespread medical obsession. This led to the invention of the safety coffin. These were complex engineering marvels equipped with air tubes, glass view plates, and, most famously, a rope tied to the deceased's hand that led to a bell on the surface. Imagine being a cemetery night watchman in 1890. The wind is howling, and suddenly you hear it. Cling, cling, cling. A bell ringing from beneath the grass. You have to dig frantically, hoping you aren't too late, or worse, hoping the ringer isn't just a shifting corpse. This is where we get the phrase, saved by the bell. A lady's fear wasn't just losing her soul to the devil, but waking up in the dark, draped in silk, with only a tiny bell to cry for help. And what happened to the tears you shed? Some Victorian women collected them in lacrimatories, small, ornate glass bottles with a specialized rim that fit perfectly against the eye. The theory was that when the tears in the bottle evaporated, the formal mourning period was over. It was a chemical countdown to recovery. You kept your sorrow in a bottle on the mantelpiece, a liquid record of your devotion. When the bottle was dry, you were allowed to smile again. Not a moment before. For years after a death, your house remained a tomb. You used black wax for every letter you wrote. You used black-edged stationery, sometimes with a border so thick there was barely room for the words. You were a woman living in a monochrome world, your identity erased by the man who was no longer there. You've spent 2 years in the dark, surrounded by the dead and the bells of the buried. But as you finally lift your black veil, you realize the world has changed. Men in universities are reading books that challenge the very existence of the soul you've been mourning. In the next part, we leave the cemetery and enter the secret study. Welcome to Forbidden Knowledge, where we discover the books that were considered too dangerous for a lady's fragile mind. Close the door, lock it, blow out the main lamp. In your lap lies a book. It's not a prayer book, and it's not a manual on how to embroider rosebuds. It is Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. To your father, this book is a sin. To your doctor, this book is a medical hazard. To you, it is the only thing keeping your mind from suffocating under a mountain of lace. Welcome to the era of intellectual oppression. In the Victorian world, a woman's brain was treated like a delicate, overheated engine. If you ran it too hard, society believed it would explode and take your fertility with it. In 1870, science was used as a cage. Prominent doctors published papers claiming that women had significantly smaller brains and frailer nervous systems. But here is the truly dark part. They argued that a woman only had a limited amount of vital energy. If you spent that energy on mathematics, Greek, or biology, there would be nothing left for your reproductive organs. They literally claimed that education caused the uterus to atrophy. A clever woman wasn't just socially awkward. She was considered a biological dead end. You were told that your curiosity was a threat to the future of the British Empire. But then came Darwin. He didn't just suggest that humans evolved from apes. He suggested that the universe didn't care about your social standing or your virtue. For a Victorian lady, reading Darwin was an act of high treason. Why? Because the entire Victorian social structure relied on the idea that women were angels in the house, divine, static, and morally superior. Darwin's theory of natural selection implied that we were all just animals driven by survival and instinct. This shattered the glass ceiling of Victorian morality. If we were just evolved creatures, then why were you trapped in a corset? Why couldn't you vote? Why were you treated like a decorative pet? If you weren't reading science, you were probably hiding yellowback novels. These were the pulp fiction of the day. Cheap, sensational stories of crime, passion, and independent women. They were called railway novels, and they were considered the mental poison of the youth. Mothers would raid their daughters' rooms looking for these yellow covers. To be caught with a sensation novel was like being caught with a bottle of gin. It suggested that your mind was overstimulated, a condition that led directly to hysteria, the catch-all diagnosis for any woman who was tired of being bored. But the most exhausting part of Victorian knowledge was the strategic ignorance. To win a husband, you had to practice the art of appearing less intelligent than you were. If a man spoke to you about politics, you were to tilt your head, look confused, and ask him to explain it to you in simple terms. You were an expert in the blank stare. You had to hide your wit like a shameful scar, because a clever girl was a blue stocking, a term of derision for women who dared to have an opinion. You lived in a world where your greatest intellectual achievement was pretending you didn't have a brain at all. And yet, you read. You read by the light of the fire. You hid pamphlets on women's suffrage inside your Bible. You discussed evolution in the language of the fan we talked about earlier. You were a secret scholar in a world of decorative dolls. Your mind was a fortress that they couldn't reach with their corsets or their arsenic wafers. You've mastered the forbidden books. Your mind is on fire with ideas of equality and evolution. But as you step out of your study and into the parlor, you face a new test. A man is approaching. He is reaching out his hand. And in 1890, a simple handshake was a physical negotiation that could lead to a lifetime of entanglement. In the next part, we explore the handshake scandal, where we discover why a woman should never ever be the first to reach out. But the cage wasn't just social, it was scientific. Welcome to the world of phrenology, the 19th century obsession with measuring skulls to determine character. Imagine a specialist running his hands over your head, feeling for bumps. He would solemnly tell your father that your causality bump was too small, but your philoprogenitiveness, the instinct to care for children, was large. These pseudoscientists argued that because a woman's skull was smoother and smaller, her brain simply lacked the machinery for abstract thought. They used calipers and rulers to build a biological prison around your potential. To them, your desire to learn physics was as unnatural as a dog wanting to play the violin. What happened if you didn't listen? What if you insisted on writing poetry, studying Greek, or, God forbid, demanding the right to vote? You were diagnosed with neurasthenia or brain exhaustion. The cure? The infamous rest cure developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. Imagine being locked in a darkened room for 6 weeks. You are forbidden to stand up. You are forbidden to sew, to draw, or to touch a pen. Most crucially, you are forbidden to read. You are fed only milk and mutton, treated like a human vegetable, until your overactive mind finally breaks and submits. This wasn't a cure. It was a lobotomy by boredom. It inspired the famous story The Yellow Wallpaper. A chilling account of a woman driven to literal madness by the very treatment meant to save her fragile brain. Since you weren't allowed real knowledge, you turned to sensation novels. These were the forbidden thrills of the Victorian parlor. Books like Lady Audley's Secret or The Woman in White were the 19th century equivalent of an addictive R-rated Netflix series. They featured women who committed bigamy, women who pushed their husbands down wells, and women who escaped insane asylums. These books were called yellowbacks because of their cheap, bright covers. To the moral police, these novels were a plague. They believed the fast-paced plots would overstimulate a lady's nervous system, leading to moral decay and, eventually, a collapse of the family unit. You hid them in your laundry basket. You read them by the flickering light of a stolen candle. They were your only window into a world where women actually did things. And for the few who actually fought their way into the universities, the ultimate insult awaited. At Oxford and Cambridge, women could attend lectures. They could take the exams. They could even outscore the men. And they often did. But they were not allowed to graduate. You could have the brain of a genius and the test scores of a scholar. But at the end of 4 years, you were handed a certificate of attendance, while the man who failed half his classes was handed a degree. You were a guest in the house of knowledge, never a resident. This was mental starvation. Society wanted you to be accomplished, meaning you could play 3 songs on the piano and speak enough French to order a lace handkerchief, but never educated. Because an educated woman is a woman who asks, why? And in the Victorian Empire, that was the most dangerous question of all. You've survived the rest cure. You've hidden your books. Your mind is a sharp hidden blade. But now you must return to the parlor. A gentleman is approaching. He is reaching out his hand. And as we move to the next part, you'll realize that even a simple touch was a high-stakes negotiation. Welcome to the handshake scandal, where we discover why a woman's hand was the most guarded territory in England. A gentleman is standing before you. He is wealthy, handsome, and respectable. He smiles, and then he does it. He extends his right hand toward you. Your heart hammers against your corset. In 2026, you just shake it. But in 1890, this is a crisis. If you reach out first, you are forward. If you don't reach out at all, you are frosty. And if your bare skin touches his, you might as well be standing there in your underclothes. Welcome to the handshake scandal. In the Victorian world, physical contact was the ultimate frontier, and the gatekeeper of that frontier was a thin layer of kid leather, the glove. First, let's talk about the chain of command. In the Victorian street or parlor, a man was never allowed to initiate a handshake with a lady. Never. He had to stand there, hands at his sides, waiting for your permission. You were the sovereign of your own space. If you chose to simply nod, he had to accept it. If you offered only a slight curtsy, he remained at a distance. To reach out to you first was seen as a physical assault on your virtue. It was an act of dominance that suggested he owned you. By forcing him to wait, society gave you a tiny, fragile piece of power, the power of the first touch. But suppose you do decide to shake his hand. You never, ever take off your glove. To a Victorian, skin-to-skin contact was an intimate, almost erotic act reserved for marriage or the most scandalous of affairs. Your glove was your human firewall. It was a barrier of fabric that said, "You may touch my hand, but you may not touch me." If a lady removed her glove to shake a man's hand in public, the room would go silent. It was a signal of such extreme familiarity that it was practically a public engagement or a public scandal. You were exposing yourself. A bare hand was a nude hand. And how do you actually shake? You don't grip. A firm, confident handshake, the kind you'd use in a business meeting today, was considered masculine and aggressive in a woman. Instead, you offered what we now call the dead fish. You gently laid your gloved fingers into his palm. No squeeze, no movement. You held it for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough to acknowledge his existence, but not long enough to suggest you enjoyed it. If you lingered, if you returned the pressure of his grip, you were sending a message. You were fast, you were dangerous. But the most complex rule of the handshake scandal was the introduction trap. You were strictly forbidden from touching, or even speaking to, anyone to whom you had not been formally introduced. Imagine a man saves your life by pulling you from the path of a runaway carriage. If no one is there to say, "Miss Evans, may I present Mr. Thompson?" You cannot shake his hand. You cannot thank him with a touch. To do so would be to acknowledge a stranger, and a stranger was a threat to your social geometry. You lived in a world where you could be physically saved by someone who, socially, didn't exist. This obsession with covering the hands led to a strange, redirected eroticism. Because the hands were locked away, the wrist became the new, forbidden zone. The tiny gap between your glove and your sleeve was the most scrutinized inch of skin in England. A loose glove button was a wardrobe malfunction that could draw gasps. You were a woman wrapped in 1,000 layers, where a simple hello was a tactical negotiation, and a handshake was a contract signed in silk. Open loop. You've survived the handshake. Your gloves are intact. Your reputation is safe. But while you are upstairs playing this high-stakes game of touch, someone is watching you. Someone who knows all your secrets, smells your arsenic makeup, and sees the bruises from your corset. In the next part, we go down the back stairs. Welcome to the secret life of servants, where the rules were broken every single day. But wait, there was one place where all these rules seemed to vanish in a cloud of perfume and violin music. The waltz. In a Victorian ballroom, you were allowed to let a man place his hand firmly on your waist. You were allowed to rest your hand on his shoulder. You were spinning, your faces inches apart, your breath mingling. To an outsider, it looked like a scandal in motion. But here is the catch. This was formal intimacy. The moment the music stopped, the firewall went back up. If you met that same man on the street the next morning, you couldn't run to him. You couldn't even shake his hand unless you had been formally introduced outside the ballroom. The waltz was a licensed hallucination, a 3-minute escape from the handshake scandal that ended the moment the bow left the string. The rules of the handshake only applied to your equals. When it came to those below you, the servants, the tradesmen, the carriage drivers, the rules were brutal. You never shook hands with a servant. To do so was to erase the hierarchy that kept the British Empire standing. If a loyal maid of 20 years saved your life, you gave her a nod or a sovereign coin. You did not give her your hand. To touch someone from a lower class was to risk social contamination. Your hand was a symbol of your rank, and you didn't distribute your rank to someone who polished your silver. But what if the armor failed? Imagine you are at a high-stakes garden party. You reach for a cup of tea, and you hear it, a tiny, sickening rip. Your glove has torn at the thumb. In 2026, it's an annoyance. In 1890, it was a catastrophe. A torn glove meant exposed skin. You were now nude in public. Every second that your bare thumb was visible was a second where your reputation was bleeding out. You would immediately hide your hand behind your back or under your shawl, making a desperate excuse to leave. You couldn't just buy another pair. You had to retreat in shame. A lady with a hole in her glove was a lady who was falling apart. And then there was the dark side of the glove, the souvenir. Young men would sometimes steal a lady's glove as a romantic token. To keep a woman's glove in your breast pocket was to claim a piece of her body. If a woman accidentally dropped her glove for a man to find, she wasn't just losing an accessory. She was sending a biometric invitation. She was saying, "You have my hand even if you cannot touch it." It was the ultimate Victorian thirsty move, a dangerous game played with silk and skin. You lived in a world where a 5-inch gap of air was your only safety. You were a master of physical negotiation, calculating the distance between your fingers and the world with the precision of a mathematician. You were untouchable, unreachable, and utterly perfectly alone behind your leather shield. You've navigated the minefield of touch. You've survived the spinning waltz and the fear of the torn glove. But while you are upstairs protecting your virtue, the people who actually run your life are watching from the shadows. In the next part, we leave the polished marble and go down the back stairs. Welcome to The Secret Life of Servants, where the angels of the house are seen for who they really are. Forget the ballroom for a moment. Step away from the gaslight and the scent of lavender. Come down the narrow, uncarpeted back stairs. In a Victorian mansion, there were two civilizations living in the same house, but they were never meant to meet. You were the help, and the first rule of being the help was simple. You were meant to be invisible. If you were caught in a hallway when the master or mistress walked by, you didn't say hello. You didn't even nod. You turned your face to the wall and stood perfectly still, like a piece of furniture, until they passed. You were a ghost in a house you spent 18 hours a day cleaning. While the angel in the house upstairs was fainting in her corset, you were the one who made the illusion possible. Your day started at 5 a.m. in the freezing dark. You hauled 40-pound buckets of coal up 5 flights of stairs to light the fires before the real people woke up. You scrubbed the grates with black lead until your hands were permanently stained a bruised purple gray, the exact opposite of the marble skin your mistress paid so much to maintain. You were the human engine of the empire. You carried the water, you emptied the slops, and you scrubbed the grease of 12 courses off the silver. You were the reality that the Victorian etiquette was trying so hard to hide. But here is the secret. Because you were invisible, you were also the most dangerous person in the house. You saw the angel without her corset. You saw the bruises on her ribs. You saw the arsenic wafers hidden in her drawer. You knew that the happy marriage upstairs was actually a Cold War fought with slammed doors and separate bedrooms. You emptied their chamber pots. You knew their health, their secrets, and their shames. The gossip mill in the servants' hall was the Victorian internet. Information traveled faster through the scullery maids than it did through the telegraph. You knew which gentleman was losing his fortune to gambling and which lady was sending stamp language letters to the stable boy. You held the keys to their reputations in your red, chapped hands. The price of your invisibility was your humanity. Most servants were forbidden from marrying. If a maid became pregnant, she wasn't just fired, she was ruined, cast out into the streets we discussed in part 6. You had 1 day off a month, if you were lucky. You were expected to love a family that didn't know your last name. You lived in a tiny, unheated attic room, sleeping on a straw mattress, while 3 floors below, your mistress complained that her silk sheets were a bit wrinkled. The contrast wasn't just a gap in wealth, it was a gap in existence. You were the silent witness to the absurdity of the age. You watched them starve themselves for a silhouette. You watched them poison their eyes for a wide-eyed look. You watched them shake hands like they were negotiating a peace treaty. And as you polished their boots for the 10th time that day, you realized something they never would. The Victorian lady was a fragile chemical construction, and you were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. You've seen the house from the bottom up. You know the dirt behind the velvet. But as you scrub the floors, you notice something else. The angel upstairs doesn't just look pale. She smells strange. Because in a world of perfumes and lace, there was a hidden battle against a very human problem: hygiene. In the next part, we uncover the hidden smells, where we discover how the Victorians stayed clean in a city that was anything but. In the movies, the Victorian era smells like lavender and old books. In reality, it smelled like 1,000 years of unwashed history. Imagine walking through a London ballroom. You see the silk, the diamonds, the angel in the house spinning in her waltz. But as you get closer, the scent of roses begins to fail. Beneath the expensive French perfume is the unmistakable heavy musk of unwashed wool, stale sweat, and human skin that hasn't seen a full tub of water in a month. Welcome to the era of the Great Stink. In the Victorian world, cleanliness wasn't about being clean. It was about appearing pure, and those are two very, very different things. If you offered a Victorian lady a hot bath every morning, she might scream. Doctors of the time warned that excessive washing was dangerous. They believed water opened the pores, allowing miasma, the bad air that supposedly carried disease, to enter the body. A full bath was a massive undertaking. It required servants to carry dozens of heavy pails of water up the back stairs, heat them over a coal fire, and fill a portable tin tub in front of the bedroom fireplace. Because it was such a chore, most upper-class people only did it once or twice a month. Instead, you performed a sponge bath. You stood at a washstand with a small basin of lukewarm water and a flannel cloth. You washed your face, your hands, and your armpits, the parts that showed. The rest of you? That was a secret kept between you and your 5 layers of unwashed petticoats. But the smell inside the house was nothing compared to the smell outside. By 1858, London had nearly 3 million people and 0 modern sewers. Everything, human waste, animal blood from butcher shops, industrial chemicals, went straight into the River Thames. The river was a thick, black soup of filth. That summer, the heat was so intense that the smell became a literal physical force. They called it the Great Stink. It was so bad that Parliament had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to be able to breathe during meetings. They thought the smell itself would kill them. It was a city of 3 million people, all living in a giant open-air toilet while pretending to be the pinnacle of civilization. And then there was your hair. A Victorian woman never shampooed her hair. Water made hair brittle and difficult to style into those complex updos. Instead, you brushed it. 100 strokes every night to distribute the oils. You might use a bit of ammonia or diluted brandy to clean the scalp once a month, but for the most part, your hair was a massive collector of coal soot, dust, and grease. To hide the smell of dirty hair, you used Macassar oil or heavy floral pomades. You were a walking bouquet of chemicals designed to mask the fact that your body was a biological reality. Hygiene was the ultimate class divider. The poor smelled of rot and labor. The rich smelled of roses and rot. You spent a fortune on violet water and eau de cologne. You carried a pomander, a small decorative ball filled with spices, just to hold to your nose when you walked past a common person. You weren't cleaning yourself. You were armoring your senses against the world you created. You've survived the smells. You've masked the reality of your body with lavender and lead. But as you sit at your writing desk to tell your secrets to a friend, you realize that even your private letters are being watched. In the next part, we unlock the correspondence crimes, where a single purple ink or a tilted stamp could be a confession of a secret life. In 1890, your reputation didn't just live in your words or your waltz. It lived in your mailbox. Before the internet, before the phone call, there was the letter. But don't be fooled by the romantic imagery of quill and parchment. A Victorian letter was a high-stakes legal document. One wrong word, one poorly chosen ink, and your private thoughts became public evidence. In a world where your parents had the moral right to read your incoming mail, writing a letter was less like a chat and more like a heist. Welcome to the era of correspondence crimes. Have you ever looked at a Victorian letter and felt a headache coming on? Look closer. Because postage was expensive and paper was a luxury, many women used a technique called cross-writing. You'd fill a page horizontally from top to bottom, then you'd turn the paper 90 degrees and write vertically right over the original text. To a modern eye, it's an illegible mess of ink. But to a Victorian lady, it was a practical necessity and a brilliant security feature. It made the letter incredibly difficult for a nosy father or a prying governess to skim read at a glance. You were encrypting your secrets in plain sight, forcing the reader to spend minutes deciphering your soul, line by agonizing line. But the real message was on the outside. Meet the wax seal. The color of the wax you chose wasn't a fashion statement. It was a status update. Red wax, business authority or formal greetings. Safe, predictable. Black wax, the mark of the mourning industry. We discussed in part 7. It told the postman and the recipient that a death had occurred before they even opened the envelope. Pink or violet wax, danger. This was the thirsty wax of the era. It suggested flirtation, intimacy, and a lack of social restraint. A lady seen sending a pink-sealed letter to a gentleman was practically screaming, "I have a secret." And if that seal arrived broken, you knew your human firewall, your father, had been there first. You lived in a world where the integrity of a bit of melted wax determined your peace of mind. When the codes weren't enough, you turned to invisible ink. Victorian schoolgirls and forbidden lovers were masters of chemistry. You would write your proper news in black ink about the weather, the garden, or the church sermon. But between the lines, using a clean nib and a bit of lemon juice or milk, you wrote the truth. The recipient would hold the paper over a warm candle or a hot iron, and slowly, like a ghost appearing from the fog, your real thoughts would brown and reveal themselves. You were direct messaging in a world of physical surveillance. And let's not forget the man in the blue uniform, the postman. In London, mail was delivered up to 12 times a day. He knew who was writing to whom. He knew whose letters smelled of cheap perfume and whose were sealed with the heavy, expensive wax of an aristocrat. The post office wasn't just a utility. It was the Victorian headquarters of social data. Your postman knew your social standing better than your own neighbors. You spent hours at your desk, your hand cramped from the steel nib, your eyes tired from the cross-writing. You were a woman building a digital world out of paper and sap. Every letter you sent was a piece of yourself launched into a world that wanted to censor you. You were a writer, a codebreaker, and a criminal, all for the sake of a private conversation. You've mastered the art of secret writing. You've licked the stamps and melted the wax. But as you fold your secrets away, the sound of carriage wheels approaches the gate. It's the London season. It's the ultimate competition where you are the product and your father is the salesman. In the next part, we enter the most brutal arena of all. Welcome to the marriage market, where we discover how a lady was appraised like a prize horse at an auction. Welcome to the London season. From April to August, the city isn't just the capital of an empire, it's a giant, glittering showroom. Look at yourself in the mirror one last time. You are 18. You've been scrubbed with arsenic, cinched into a 16-inch corset, and taught to speak French with a flawless accent. You are the product. Your father is the CEO, and today is your IPO, your initial public offering. In the Victorian world, marriage wasn't a union of souls. It was a merger of estates. It was a cold, calculated transfer of wealth and bloodlines. Welcome to the marriage market, where the most dangerous thing you could bring to a negotiation was your heart. The season begins with the ultimate unboxing video. You are dressed in white, a color that screams unused asset. You wear a train so long it requires its own staff to manage, and 3 white ostrich feathers in your hair. You stand in a line for hours with hundreds of other girls, all waiting for 30 seconds in front of the queen. You curtsy so low your knees touch the floor. If you wobble, you're damaged goods. If you look too confident, you're vulgar. The queen's nod is the stamp of approval that officially lists you on the market. From this moment on, every man in London is looking at you, not as a woman, but as a potential investment. If you want to be sold at the highest price, you need to get into Almack's. This was the most exclusive club in London, ruled by the Lady Patronesses, 7 high-ranking women who were more powerful than the Prime Minister. They were the original gatekeepers. If they gave you a voucher to attend their Wednesday night balls, your value skyrocketed. If they rejected you, you were social trash. At Almack's, the men would lean against the walls, appraising the debutantes like prize horses at Tattersall's auction. They weren't looking for a personality. They were checking your teeth, your health, your gait, your grace, and most importantly, your balance sheet, your dowry. Look at that little piece of ivory hanging from your wrist, your dance card. This wasn't a souvenir. It was a business ledger. A lady's dance card was the most scrutinized document in London. If the same man's name appeared more than twice, the market started to speculate. Are they engaged? Is there a scandal? You had to distribute your dances strategically. You gave the waltz to the earl with the 10,000-acre estate. You gave the quadrille to the younger son with the good military record. You were a master of portfolio diversification. If your card remained empty for too long, you were a wallflower, a devaluing asset that would soon be delisted from the market. Behind the silk fans and the champagne, the real work was happening in the smoking rooms. This was where the fathers negotiated the marriage settlement. What is she worth? Was the question. £10,000? 20? A share in a railway company? A Victorian bride didn't bring herself to a marriage. She brought a dowry. If your price was too low, the Duke's son wouldn't even look at your fan signals. If your price was high, your arsenic complexion and your handshake scandal were suddenly forgotten. You were a financial transaction wrapped in white lace. The clock was ticking. You had 3 seasons, 3 years to sell. If you reached 25 without a ring, the market lost interest. You became an old maid or a spinster. This wasn't just a label, it was an economic death sentence. You became the unpaid servant in your brother's house. You were the ghost at the feast, the woman who failed to convert. The fear of this exile was the whip that kept you in that corset and made you smile at men you despised. You've played the market, you've filled your dance card, you've negotiated your price. But what happens when the deal falls through? What happens when you follow your heart instead of the ledger? Or when a secret from your past is leaked to the papers? In the next part, we explore the dark side of the season. Welcome to Public Scandals and Exile, where we discover how quickly a lady can become a pariah. But by the 1880s, the London marriage market faced a foreign invasion. Meet the dollar princesses. These were the daughters of American new money. Oil tycoons, railway kings, and steel magnates from New York and Chicago. They had millions of dollars, but zero social standing. Meanwhile, the British aristocracy had centuries of blue blood and grand estates, but they were literally broke. It was a perfect, cold-blooded trade. An American heiress would bring a dowry of $2 million, enough to fix the leaky roof of a 400-year-old castle. And in return, she got a duchess or countess title. You were a domestic asset, being disrupted by foreign venture capital. If you were a British girl with a mere £10,000, you couldn't compete with the American dollar. You were being priced out of your own ballroom. But where there is money, there are vultures. Enter the fortune hunter. These were younger sons of noble families who had no inheritance. They were charming, they waltzed perfectly, and they were experts in strategic romance. A fortune hunter didn't look for a soulmate. He looked for a marriage settlement that could pay off his gambling debts. He would target you, use the language of the fan against you, and whisper forbidden knowledge in your ear, all to get your father into a room with a lawyer. If you fell for a fortune hunter, you weren't just losing your heart, you were liquidating your family's future for a man who loved your bank account more than your face. Let's talk about the physical appraisal. When you were at a ball, the men weren't just looking at you. They were performing a due diligence check. They checked the clarity of your skin to ensure you weren't hiding the effects of lead poisoning. They watched the way you stood to gauge the strength of your spine beneath the corset. They even listened to your laugh, not to see if you were happy, but to check for the rattle of tuberculosis in your lungs. You were being inspected like a piece of high-end machinery. If you showed a single defect, your market value dropped by half in a single evening. By July, the inventory was exhausted. You've attended 3 balls every night for 3 months. You've danced 500 miles in silk slippers that have ruined your feet. Your arsenic complexion is starting to fail, replaced by the genuine gray of total exhaustion. But you cannot stop. To stop is to withdraw from the market. You push through the fatigue, drinking fortifying tonics of ammonia and caffeine just to stay upright for one more waltz. Because the season ends in August, and if you haven't closed the deal by then, you have to face the long, cold winter as an unsold asset. The season ends not with a kiss, but with a signature on a legal contract. The marriage market is a brutal, exhausting, and expensive game where the winners get a title they don't love, and the losers get a life of invisibility. You were a lady, but on this song, you were just a number in a ledger. You've survived the auction. You've navigated the dollar princesses and the fortune hunters. But what happens when the contract is broken? What happens when a whisper starts in the scullery and ends in the headlines of the Morning Post? In the next part, we explore the ultimate Victorian fear. Welcome to Public Scandals in Exile, where we discover the social death that was worse than the grave. You walk into the room. You've spent 2 hours on your hair, your corset is tighter than ever, and your arsenic complexion is flawless. But as you approach your best friend, she doesn't smile. She doesn't even blink. She looks directly through you, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind your head, as if you have suddenly turned into air. Welcome to the social cut. In 1895, this was the ultimate weapon. It wasn't a scream or an insult. It was a total, synchronized erasure of your existence. You haven't just been insulted, you've been exiled while standing in the middle of a crowded room. In the Victorian world, a scandal wasn't a headline. It was a death sentence delivered in silence. The cut direct was the most brutal move in the etiquette playbook. If a lady was suspected of a moral lapse, perhaps she was seen alone with a man, or a letter with a pink wax seal was intercepted, society didn't wait for a trial. The matrons of London, the lady patronesses we met in the marriage market, would simply decide you no longer existed. When you passed them on the street, they wouldn't nod. When you entered a shop, they would leave. Within 24 hours, your dance card would be empty, your invitations would stop arriving, and even your own servants would look at you with pity. You were a pariah, a social ghost haunting the city that once worshipped you. Here is the bitter truth. Scandal was a gendered trap. A gentleman could gamble away his fortune, maintain a secret family in the East End, and be caught in a drunken brawl at his club. Society would call it sowing his wild oats. He might be withdrawn for a month, but he always returned. But for you, a single lapse in judgment was irreversible. There was no rehab for a Victorian lady's reputation. Once the mirror of virtue was cracked, you were ruined. The very society that forced you into a corset and poisoned your skin with lead would be the first to cast you out. You were a sacrifice to the gods of propriety, a warning to every other girl to stay in line. If the scandal reached the divorce court, your life was over. Until 1857, a woman couldn't even initiate a divorce. And even after the laws changed, a woman found guilty of adultery lost everything. You didn't just lose your husband, you lost your children. Under Victorian law, children were the property of the father. If you were exiled for a scandal, you were often forbidden from ever seeing your children again. You were a woman without a home, without a name, and without a family. Many exiled women fled to the continent, to France or Italy, living in cheap boarding houses under assumed names, hoping the English tourists wouldn't recognize the fallen angel from the London papers. The scandal lived in the agony columns of the newspapers. These were anonymous coded messages in the classifieds where secrets were traded in public. To the lady in the green velvet, the secret is known. Silence can be bought. You lived in a state of permanent blackmail anxiety. Your maid, your coachman, your discarded lovers, everyone held a piece of your social life. In a world of total surveillance, the only way to be truly safe was to be truly invisible. But as we've seen, invisibility was its own kind of prison. You are standing on the deck of a steamship, watching the white cliffs of Dover disappear into the fog. You are exiled. You have your jewels, perhaps a small allowance, but you have lost the only thing that mattered in the 19th century: the right to be seen. You were a masterpiece of etiquette, and now you are just a cautionary tale whispered behind fans in the parlors. You'll never enter again. You've seen the rise and the devastating fall of the Victorian lady. You've walked through the poisons, the cages, the secret codes, and the social exiles. But as the 20th century approaches, the corset is beginning to loosen. In the final part of our journey, we look at the legacy of restraint and discover why, even in 2026, we are still living with the ghosts of the Victorian world. January 22nd, 1901. The Queen is dead. As the black-plumed horses carry Victoria to her grave, a collective breath is finally released across the empire. The century of the angel in the house is over. The corsets are beginning to snap. The arsenic wafers are being thrown into the trash. The language of the fan is being replaced by the roar of the motor car and the ringing of the telephone. You think you are free? You think the Victorian woman is just a ghost in a museum, a cautionary tale of a dark, repressed past. But look closer at your reflection in your smartphone, because in 2026, the ghosts of the 19th century haven't disappeared. They've just gone digital. You no longer wear steel ribs to achieve an 18-inch waist. Instead, you wear filters. You use AI to rearrange your facial features to smooth your skin into that same translucent pallor that the Victorians achieved with lead. You spend hours tight-lacing your digital persona, ensuring that every pixel of your life is proper and curated. The social geometry of the London street has become the algorithm of the social feed. One wrong post, one social scandal caught on camera, and the social cut returns. Now we call it cancel culture. The exile is just as cold. The silence is just as absolute. We mock the Victorian lady for painting her face with poison. But look at our own vanity tables. We inject neurotoxins into our foreheads to freeze our expressions, much like the modest gaze of the 1880s. We follow parasite diets and chemical cleanses that would make a Victorian doctor nod in approval. The goal hasn't changed: to achieve a biological impossibility through chemical intervention. We are still dying for a look, still sacrificing our vital energy to satisfy a market that appraises us every time we hit post. The agony columns haven't disappeared. They've become X and Reddit. The stamp language has become the emoji. We are still code breaking. We still spend hours analyzing why a message was seen but not answered, or why a like was tilted with a specific intent. We are still masters of correspondence crimes, living in a world of total surveillance where our private letters are stored in a cloud that never forgets. The Victorian woman was a masterpiece of restraint. She was a silent, chemical, steel-bound work of art. And in many ways, so are we. We have traded the chaperone for the follower, the ballroom for the platform, and the arsenic wafer for the beauty filter. The legacy of the Victorian era isn't just about fashion. It's about the performance of perfection. It's the haunting idea that to be worthy, you must be controlled. That to be ladylike is to be invisible as a human being and visible only as an image. As you put down your device and step out into the world of 2026, ask yourself, have you really escaped the corset? Or have you just learned to love the laces? You are the descendant of the angel in the house. You are the evolution of the fallen woman. You are a masterpiece of history, and the clock is still ticking.